R. Kelly once sounded incredibly confident when he spoke about the accusations against him.
Because for one, I beat my case. When you beat something,
In interviews and public statements, he repeatedly insisted that the truth would eventually come out and that he would beat the allegations. For a long time, many of his fans believed him. But that confidence was shattered when a jury eventually found him guilty and he received a 30-year prison sentence. For years, the story surrounding R. Kelly had been clouded by controversy.
What made you decide to write your book?
It took a lot of
Unanswered questions and conflicting narratives. And now, as new details continue to surface, the case has revealed an even darker and more complicated reality than many people originally imagined. This is the story of a case that for decades never truly felt closed. It began with a package. On February 8, 2002, the newsroom of the Chicago Sun-Times received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside that envelope was a videotape. At first glance, it looked like just another anonymous tip sent to a newspaper, but what investigators and journalists soon discovered inside that tape would ignite one of the most shocking scandals in modern music history.
Son was the biggest reason I decided to write the book. Nobody is more qualified to speak on my experience more than.
According to reports from the Chicago Sun-Times published that same day, the tape allegedly showed R. Kelly, one of the biggest stars in R&B at the time, engaging in sexual acts with a girl who appeared to be underage. The video also contained disturbing footage of him urinating on the girl. The allegations were explosive. At the time, R. Kelly was not just a celebrity, he was a global superstar whose music dominated radio stations, charts, and award shows. To many people, the idea that someone with such influence and success could be involved in something so disturbing seemed almost impossible to process. Kelly immediately denied the accusations. He insisted that the man in the tape was not him.
And I really wanted him to have the true narrative of what really took place.
But the legal system moved forward. On June 5, 2002, a grand jury indicted R. Kelly on 21 counts of child pornography. Shortly afterward, he was arrested in Miami. His bond was set at $750,000, which he posted before being released while awaiting trial. What followed was one of the most closely watched celebrity legal battles of the early 2000s. For years, the case dragged through the court system with delays, legal arguments, and constant media attention. By the time the trial finally began, the entire country had been hearing about the allegations for nearly 6 years. And then, in 2008, the verdict stunned many people. On June 13, 2008, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury acquitted R. Kelly on all 14 remaining counts. For many observers, the decision felt shocking. The tape had circulated publicly for years. Millions of people had heard about it. Yet in court, the prosecution faced a critical problem, one that would ultimately collapse their case. The girl in the tape never confirmed that it was her. Throughout the trial, she was referred to only as Jane Doe. Without her testimony identifying herself as the person in the video, prosecutors could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the girl was a minor. That single missing piece of evidence created enough uncertainty for the jury to return a verdict of not guilty. And just like that, R. Kelly walked out of the courtroom a free man.
It was the only true way I could reclaim my name, Rashona Landfair.
But for many people, the story never truly ended there. For years after the acquittal, the case lingered in an uncomfortable space, somewhere between unresolved allegations, public speculation, and quiet trauma for the person who had been at the center of the entire controversy. That person was Rashona Landfair.
She was only 14 years old when the tape was recorded. Landfair grew up in Chicago, surrounded by a family that had deep connections to the local music scene. Like many teenagers with dreams of performing, she wanted to build a career in music. One of her relatives was Sparkle, an R&B singer who had professional ties to R. Kelly during the 1990s. Through those connections, Landfair was introduced to Kelly while she was still very young. At that time, R. Kelly seemed untouchable. By the late 1990s, he had sold more than 75 million records worldwide, won multiple Grammy Awards, and produced some of the biggest songs in R&B history, including I Believe I Can Fly, Ignition, and Bump and Grind.
Why did anybody advocate for you? Did anybody speak out for you?
For a young girl in Chicago who dreamed about becoming a singer, being around someone like R. Kelly felt like standing next to the doorway of opportunity. It felt like a dream. But according to Landfair, that dream quickly became something very different. For more than 2 decades, the world only knew her as Jane Doe. Now she is finally speaking publicly in her own words. Her voice first gained wider attention through interviews in her memoir, Who's Watching Shorty, where she explained why she decided to tell her story after years of silence. My son was the biggest reason I decided to write the book, she explained. Nobody is more qualified to speak on my experience than I am. Her decision to finally come forward changed the narrative around the case. For years, the R. Kelly story had been told primarily by prosecutors, defense attorneys, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. But now, for the first time, the woman who was at the center of the most important piece of evidence in the original trial was speaking for herself. And what she revealed shed light on questions that had remained unanswered for years. She spoke about how the grooming process began, how it slowly escalated, what her family knew at the time, and why fear kept her from identifying herself during the 2008 trial. Because according to Landfair, there was always one person who knew exactly what the truth was, and that person was her.
View the tape to identify myself and to be able to fully
To understand how she became entangled in Kelly's world, you also have to understand the environment surrounding him in the 1990s. R. Kelly wasn't just famous, he was a powerful figure in Chicago's black music community. His influence extended far beyond concert stages and recording studios. He had grown up in Chicago himself, born on January 8, 1967 in Hyde Park, and raised in the Ida B. Wells public housing projects. He came from the same neighborhoods and cultural environment as many of the families who would later cross paths with him. That familiarity mattered. Kelly didn't feel like a distant Hollywood celebrity. He appeared at church events, local talent shows, and community performances. He knew people, and those people knew other people. His career had also reached extraordinary heights. He had worked with Aaliyah, produced Michael Jackson's hit You Are Alone, and blended gospel influences with R&B in a way that resonated deeply within black communities. His music played at family gatherings. His songs were heard in churches. His success was celebrated across Chicago. So when a young girl with musical ambitions encountered someone like Robert Kelly, it didn't seem dangerous. It felt like destiny. But in cases involving grooming, ambition is often the very thing that predators use as the entry point. Experts who study grooming behavior consistently describe the same pattern. The person doing the grooming identifies something the victim wants desperately: recognition, opportunity, mentorship, and positions themselves as the person who can provide it. That dynamic creates emotional dependency long before any physical boundary is crossed. According to Landfair's account, what began as a professional connection gradually turned into something far more personal and inappropriate.
You have to go through to get to this point, to be vocal and identify yourself.
Kelly praised her talent. He gave her attention. He made her feel special in ways that separated her from everyone else around her. And slowly, step by step, the boundary shifted. That gradual escalation is what makes grooming so difficult to recognize from the inside. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds in small increments, each moment feeling like a natural extension of the last. Nothing seems shocking at first. By the time the behavior becomes clearly abusive, the victim is often already deeply entangled, emotionally, socially, and sometimes financially. By the late 1990s, when the tape was recorded, Landfair says she had already been in Kelly's orbit for years. She was just 14 years old. And the recording, according to her later testimony, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger environment, one that would later become central to federal investigations years later, an environment that prosecutors would eventually describe not as isolated misconduct, but as a structured system of control and exploitation. It was the cumulative weight of those stories placed side by side that made the situation impossible to ignore. For years, individual allegations against R. Kelly had surfaced and faded from public attention, but when they were presented together, when multiple voices described similar experiences, the pattern became much harder to dismiss. The documentary Surviving R. Kelly featured several accusers speaking openly about their experiences. Among them was Rashona Landfair, who testified that she began a sexual relationship with Kelly when she was just 16 years old. Another woman, Kitty Jones, described what she said was a controlling and abusive environment surrounding Kelly. Parents of young women who had allegedly been drawn into Kelly's inner circle also spoke out. They described daughters who had suddenly become distant, unreachable, and isolated after entering Kelly's world. Across those testimonies, a disturbing pattern emerged. The documentary detailed alleged grooming tactics, promises of career advancement in music, invitations to recording sessions or studio time, and opportunities that seemed like life-changing moments for aspiring performers. But according to the women who spoke out, those opportunities often came with strict control. They described being isolated in hotel rooms or recording studios, cut off from family members, and placed under strict rules about how they could communicate with the outside world. Some said their movements were monitored. Others said their phones were taken away. Several described being pressured or coerced into sexual acts. For Rashona Landfair, watching those testimonies was something deeply personal. It was recognition. She had lived through something strikingly similar. The stories the women were telling were not abstract to her. They mirrored experiences she herself had endured years earlier. But there was one important difference. This time, the women speaking out were doing so publicly, with their faces visible and their full names attached to their stories. For Landfair, that mattered. For more than 2 decades, she had existed in the public narrative only as Jane Doe, an anonymous figure at the center of one of the most controversial celebrity cases in recent history.
Seeing other survivors step forward helped give her something she had been building toward quietly for years. It gave her a frame. And perhaps even more importantly, it gave her a community. But this is not a story with a clean ending. It is not the kind of story where a trial verdict, even a federal conviction, neatly closes the wound. Healing from childhood abuse, especially abuse that unfolded publicly and became the subject of national headlines, is not a process measured in months or years. It often takes decades, and sometimes the healing never fully arrives.
A lot of prayer. It took a lot of forgiveness of myself, the people around me, and just really confronting who I really was.
Still, the impact of the documentary reached far beyond public opinion. It helped trigger legal action. In February 2019, prosecutors in Cook County, Illinois, charged R. Kelly with 10 counts of aggravated criminal sexual abuse involving 4 victims between 1998 and 2010. Then the case expanded dramatically. On July 11, 2019, Kelly was arrested again, this time on federal charges filed in the Eastern District of New York. The charges included racketeering, sex trafficking, forced labor, child exploitation, and violations of the Mann Act. For decades, many critics had argued that accountability had stalled. Now, suddenly, the machinery of the federal justice system was moving. Kelly was denied bail multiple times, with prosecutors arguing that he posed a flight risk and a potential danger to witnesses. The first major federal trial began on August 18, 2021 in Brooklyn, before U.S. District Judge Ann M. Donnelly. Prosecutors presented a sweeping case. They argued that R. Kelly had operated what was essentially a criminal enterprise spanning more than 25 years. According to the government, Kelly used his fame and influence to lure young women and girls, some as young as 14, into abusive relationships. The legal strategy was crucial. Rather than treating each allegation as an isolated incident, prosecutors used racketeering laws, typically associated with organized crime cases. This allowed them to connect events that had occurred across multiple states and over many years into one broader pattern of criminal behavior. Under that framework, each witness who took the stand was not just describing a personal experience, they were contributing to a larger picture. In total, 11 witnesses testified, including Rashona Landfair, and 2 male accusers who had said they had been recruited and abused as teenagers. Former staff members also testified. They described rules that victims were allegedly forced to follow, avoiding eye contact with others, maintaining strict diets, and remaining constantly available for Kelly. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. On September 27, 2021, after less than a full day of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. R. Kelly was found guilty on all 9 counts. On June 29, 2022, Judge Donnelly sentenced him to 30 years in federal prison.
Kelly girl. There's so much more to me than what happened to me when I was 14 years old.
But the legal process was not finished. A second federal trial followed in Chicago, beginning on August 15, 2022. In that case, Kelly and 2 former associates faced additional charges. Prosecutors alleged that Kelly had produced child pornography in the late 1990s, enticed minors for sexual acts, and obstructed justice during the original 2008 trial. One of the key witnesses in that case was the woman who had once been known only as Jane Doe. She testified that Kelly had groomed her beginning when she was 13 years old. According to her testimony, he initially presented himself as a mentor, even describing her as a kind of goddaughter, before gradually manipulating and exploiting that trust. She also said she was pressured into helping recruit other girls. On September 14, 2022, the jury convicted Kelly on 6 of 13 counts. Then came the sentence. On February 23, 2023, U.S. District Judge Harry D. Leinenweber sentenced Kelly to 20 additional years in prison. Because much of that sentence runs concurrently with the earlier conviction, the effective total came to 31 years. 31 years. For many survivors, the verdicts did not bring celebration. They brought something quieter. Hope. That single word captures the emotional weight many victims have carried for decades. Hope that the truth had finally been heard. Hope that the system, however slowly, had finally caught up. As of March 2026, R. Kelly remains incarcerated at Federal Correctional Institution Butner Medium 1 in North Carolina. His projected release date is December 21, 2045, when he will be nearly 79 years old. Multiple appeals have already been rejected. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the New York conviction in February 2025, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case later that year. Similarly, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the Chicago conviction in April 2024, and the Supreme Court declined to hear that appeal as well. Legally speaking, most experts consider the case effectively settled. So when people online began talking about new evidence in the R. Kelly case in early 2026, the phrase did not refer to newly discovered legal documents or hidden recordings. Instead, it referred to something far more personal. The voice of Rashona Landfair. Through interviews and her book, Who's Watching Shorty, she has described in detail what happened in the late 1990s, why she remained silent during the 2008 trial, and how those experiences shaped the rest of her life. That testimony does not reopen the case, but it completes the story. For years, she had been reduced in the public imagination to a label, the R. Kelly girl. Not a person, not a life, just a reference point in someone else's scandal. By speaking out, she reclaimed something that had been taken from her, her name, her identity, her story. The R. Kelly saga ultimately represents more than the downfall of a once-celebrated music icon. It reflects a broader cultural reckoning about power, celebrity, and the systems that allowed allegations to remain unresolved for so many years. For decades, Kelly's fame and influence appeared to shield him from full accountability. Even as accusations surfaced, the combination of loyal fans, industry support, and complicated legal barriers meant that the truth often remained obscured. But the courage of survivors who eventually spoke out reshaped that narrative. Their testimonies forced the public, the music industry, and the legal system to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility and justice. And while the legal chapter of the story may now be closed, its broader impact continues to unfold. Because sometimes the most powerful evidence is not a document or a video. Sometimes it is simply a voice, finally being heard. Thanks for watching.